Good morning, Year 8. Welcome to your third lesson of history. And today we're going to be looking at the significance of the Titanic. Something I found really quite interesting. I've watched quite a few documentaries on the Titanic. And this is just kind of like a whistle-stop tour, but hopefully something you might find quite interesting. So we're going to look at the key events surrounding the Titanic story, and then we're going to evaluate the reasons why so many people died on board. Okay, so to really highlight why this is such a significant event in history. And at a time in history that we are currently studying. So last week we looked at the 1900s and what life was like and attitudes, and this story, this disaster that happened, reflects those attitudes at the time. So to start us off, let's have a go at answering the questions from last week. So what can you remember about what was happening in 1900 Britain? So just pause the video here and have a go at answering those 5 questions. Let's see how you did. So, which monarch died in 1901? It was Queen Victoria, and the new king was King Edward VII. Can you give 2 examples of the liberal reforms? You could choose anything from free school meals, school medical service, old age pensions, National Insurance Act. What year did Roundtree carry out his investigation in York? It was 1901. And the percentage of the population in East London living in poverty, according to Booth, was 35%. And if you remember, one of the reasons why the Liberals acted was because there was so much poverty in 1900 Britain. So remember, when we're looking at Titanic, the proportion of those living in poverty is really quite high. It's very significant, and there's a small minority that are rich, and that kind of shows through as we go through the story of the Titanic. So a few facts just to start us off this morning. The Titanic was built between 1909 and 1911 by the White Star Line Company in Belfast. And if you go to Belfast, I've never been, but a friend has been, and there's a Titanic museum, you can go and have a look. It was 882 feet in length and 175 feet in height. Essentially, the length of the Titanic was more than 3 football pitches, so it was very, very big. The Titanic had a crew of around 900 people, so that includes everyone from engineers to running the ship to obviously working on board, serving food, cooks, cleaners, everything. It was a luxury liner that carried some of the world's richest people as well as others looking for a new life in America. So they had a really good first class section. It was it's like a 5-star hotel on a ship. Very, very posh. There was pools, there was gyms, there was a tennis court as well. And if you wanted to buy a top range ticket, so if you wanted the best place on the Titanic, it would cost around £870. Then, in today's money, about £27,000. Okay, so that's how elite it was. On board, there were about 322 rich, so they didn't have the majority, they were in the minority, and then the rest, the majority, were poor, so about 709 who were living in quite bad poverty, and a lot of them were actually buying one-way tickets. It wasn't like they were going on a big luxury cruise. They actually just wanted to get from Southampton or from Britain to America to start a new life, and some would only pay about £3, which is about 20 quid for, well, no, £3, it was about £60, I think, in today's money, and that was like a basic 3rd class compartment. You wouldn't really have any windows or anything like that, and it'd be very cramped. You'd be sharing it with other people, a bit like a hostel. So there was a real mix of people. There was also a mix of who was on board. So you've got sort of the rich, you've got the poor, but it was a lot of people from lots of different places that wanted to get to America. So we had lots of different nationalities, like the Irish, people from Russia, from Italy, from France, from Germany, all wanting to start this new life in America, living the American dream, as it was classed as. So the Titanic was intended to go from Southampton in England all the way to New York. And in its hull, so in like the sort of almost bottom, but not the very bottom of the ship, it had 16 watertight compartments, which is why they say that the ship was unsinkable, because you'd have to have 4 or 5 of these watertight compartments would need to fill in order for it to sink. And if that happened, then it would sink. But they were like, well, they're watertight, so therefore they'll never fill with water, and therefore it's an unsinkable ship. And everyone was like, oh, how exciting, this is great. However, we know that 4 days into the voyage, unfortunately, in the middle of the Atlantic, the ship hit an iceberg and fell to the bottom of the sea. And these are the remains of the Titanic at the bottom of the sea. This is a picture I found of it. The remains of the Titanic weren't actually found until 1985. So it sunk in 1911, but it wasn't until 1985 that they found where it was at the bottom of the ocean. And there's been quite a lot of studies around, and as you can see on the picture, they've got lots of things like looking in the cameras to see what it's like. And there were 3 key people. There's quite a lot of people, but these are kind of the 3 key people that we look at when we look at the Titanic. So you've got over here Captain Smith. Now, Captain Smith was the captain of the ship, of the Titanic. He stayed on board, so when the ship was going down, he decided to stay on board, help other people onto the lifeboats, and try and get as many people as he could off board. And so he unfortunately died, and is almost painted like a hero. Some accused him of trying to steer the Titanic too fast, and said that it was because he was trying to break the speed record, that they didn't slow down in time enough before they hit the iceberg. I watched a documentary a couple of years ago where there's been some recent speculation as to whether one of the reasons why it was going so fast is because there was one of the coal bunkers, there was a small fire, so they needed to get rid of that coal out of the bunker and kept using it, which obviously just increased the speed of the ship, and that was why. So there's speculation, there's lots of different reasons. Then over here we've got Thomas Andrew. So Thomas Andrew was the director of the shipbuilders, and he was also the designer of the ship. He also died on board. He was on board the maiden voyage and unfortunately stayed on to try and help others, and died in the process. When he designed the ship, he wanted 32 lifeboats on the ship, but he was overruled and told, well, no, that wouldn't be, there wouldn't be enough room for the first class, and so let's just have 20, and therefore not enough for everyone, but apparently it was unsinkable, so why would you need enough for everyone? And then finally we've got this guy, Bruce Ismay, who is the managing director of the White Star Line company, so the people that organised the ship. He survived. He managed to get on one of the last lifeboats and survive. Some people called him a coward for doing so. But the White Star Company, the Titanic had been delayed quite a few times before it took on its maiden voyage, and the company was actually going through quite a lot of financial hardship. So some people argue that they're to blame because a lot of the materials used to build the Titanic were actually very cheap, and therefore when it came to crashing into the iceberg, one of the reasons why it collapsed so quickly was because of all the cheap rivets they used, and the cheap steel just broke in the cold. So some people would blame him. So the Titanic was quite a big symbol, and if you've ever come across anything about it, representing society at the time and emphasising this big gap between the rich people and the poor people. So when I talk about the rich, you can probably think about Lady Agnes or Lord Joffrey in your journals, and then when we talk about the poor, we're talking about Peasant John, okay? And so when we look at the Titanic, think about how you've looked at your character journals throughout this year, and think about how they would have acted, how they would have been. And when we come to it, you might think about whether you think they would have survived or not on board. So just 4 days into its maiden voyage, on the 14th of April, the Titanic moved into the freezing waters. The temperatures dropped below zero. It was very, very cold. And then in the darkness of the night, They were heading towards icebergs. It was a possibility that they could hit one. One of the lookouts spotted an iceberg, but despite trying to avoid it, the engines working overtime to try and change the direction of the ship, unfortunately it struck the iceberg at speed and was therefore below. It was quite a big iceberg. It was below the waterline, so it scraped the bottom of the ship, which kind of ripped it open. Remember how I talked about cheap materials being used to build it? So 5 of the watertight compartments had been gashed open, water flooded in. The ship could only stay afloat with 4 compartments filled with water, and therefore less than 3 hours later it actually sunk to the bottom. Now, like I said earlier, Thomas Andrews was overridden and they reduced the number of passenger lifeboats on the ship. When the ship they knew it was coming down, they decided that they needed to but put all the women and children into lifeboats first. They should be the priority, and then it should be the men. Now, if you look at the figures in front of you, over here we've got the first class, okay, percentages. So there were 144 women. 139 were rescued, so 97% of women were rescued in first class, and 100% of children were rescued from first class. Only 34% of the men were. With regards to the second class, we've got 84% of women being rescued and 100% of the children being rescued, and only 8% of the men. And then the third class, so these, would have been sort of the more poverty-stricken, really cheap tickets. 55% of the women were rescued, and only 30% of the children were. Now, it is said that when they were getting people onto the lifeboats, they started with the first class and they actually held back the second and third class to try and keep the panic on the ship deck at bay. So in total, there were about 2,206 people on board. 704 were rescued, so that's only 32% of everyone on board the Titanic were rescued. So what I'd like to do is have a go at these 3 questions just below, so you can pause the video and have a go at these 3 questions in your books. So which class of the passengers suffered the most? Do you think the order for women and children to get on the lifeboats was followed? So if you look at all of these results, do you think that is what happened, or do you think it wasn't? And then explain your answer. And also, what does this evidence tell us about the attitude that the rich had towards the poor? And think about that. So have a go at answering those 3 questions and pause the video here. Okay. So why did so many die? Why were so few saved on board the Titanic? We're going to have a little look at that together. So it sank, 1,500 people died, just over 700 survived, which is really not that much at all. And some people kind of put it down to these 5 key things. So was it because of the weather that so many didn't survive? Was it the attitudes of the rich, the design of the ship, the inactions of the ship crew, or the inaction of others? Okay, so I've got some evidence and we're going to go through it together and decide what there might be. I say together, it's more going to be me. Hopefully you agree with me. So the Titanic had a great deal of luxurious accommodation which added to the weight and made her sink faster. So she had lots of accommodation, sunk faster, so that would be because of the design of the ship. So I'm going to put D for design of the ship, so I'll just do like the beginning of each letter, okay, so, or design, okay. Ice flows were very common in the Atlantic, and actually the ice flows that were happening were larger than expected, so that, that's no one else's fault, that's because of the weather, okay. There were only enough lifeboats for half the passengers. Again, that is the design of the ship, so we're just going to put a D. A report indicated that none of the 7 iceberg warnings issued had actually reached the bridge of the captain. So you could talk about that being the ship crew, and actually just them not having picked it up, so they'd not picked it up, so that would be the ship crew. The watertight compartments were only designed to keep the Titanic afloat if 4 out of 16 compartments were flooded, and reports indicated that 5 were flooded due to the design. So again, design is a common flaw. The designer protested that half of the lifeboats were removed to make the ship look pretty, and he was overruled by the owner of the ship. So again, that's because of the design of the ship. You could also argue the inaction. Why did he not try and do more about it? So we'll just put in action. Oh, it takes me so much longer, I apologise. First class passengers were evacuated. First and third and second class were temporarily sealed below decks to prevent panic and disruptions spreading. So that's the actions of the ship crew, isn't it? Because they were the ones that sealed them there. So we'll put ship crew. So let's put SC, ship crew. The captain sounds for the call of assistance at 12 AM on April. The first assistance doesn't arrive until 4 AM. So that's the inaction of others. So we'll just put in for inaction of others. Okay. The ice floe made the water very cold. The fact that the water was good, leaving a clear sky, meant that the water temperatures dropped below freezing. So that's kind of to do with weather. If anyone fell into the water and they were in there for any longer than 30 minutes, they were just going to freeze to death. If the weather had been better, if it had been warmer, people would have had, you know, a better survival chance, and if they got when they got rescued, would have been more likely to have still been alive. 16 water compartments were designed to close and prevent any sinking. The compartment doors weren't tall enough, therefore the water overflowed. Again, the design of the ship. Okay, so I've got 5 more. So Titanic was 883 feet long, the longest ship ever built, which meant it was really hard to turn in an emergency. So again, that would be the design of the ship. The third class passengers were not allowed on lifeboats with first class passengers. The first class passengers did not want to sit with the lower classes. So that's obviously to do with the attitudes of the rich. So I'm going to put R to indicate the attitudes of the rich. The first reports of the icebergs received were on the 12th and went on until the 14th. And the crew of the Titanic did not alter their speed or direction. So that's the inactions of the crew. I'm just going to actually do that. That's probably a little bit easier, isn't it? And the daily lifeboat drills, which they had to kind of prepare people. You know how we have what do I call them? Fire drills, a bit like that. They were meant to have those, but the church services were seen as more valuable, and Titanic was unsinkable, so why did they need to practice? So that's the inaction of the ship crew, really, and the inaction of others that led to that. And then there was a ship, the Carpathia, which became aware that the Titanic was in trouble. It came to assistance. It came at the fastest speed that it could, and it helped to save the 705 people. But some people blame the fact that there was Captain Tom knew about it, was told by crew, like woken up saying, oh look, there's fireworks coming from the Titanic, they might be in distress, and he went, oh, it's probably just a party, and took a lot longer to respond. So a lot of people are unhappy with that. Then I've just put, there's a link, if you go to where this video is, in the comments section, that link that's on my slide is on there, and it's just like a under 10 minutes summary of the Titanic, but it shows you lots of pictures of what it looked like, and talks you through everything that I've talked you through. So you might want to watch that, because that might help you with this final task that I've got for you. So I want to know, why do you think, so your opinion, why do you think so many people died when the Titanic sank? So I've put, you can draw this continuum line out in your book, and then these are kind of like the 5 main reasons, so you could just pop them on. So like weather, maybe that's a really likely reason, so you'll put weather on yours in your book, because of the iceberg. You might think attitudes is not, so you might put attitudes. It's up to you. There's no right or wrong. I'm guessing these are not what my opinions would be. And then I'd like to answer it in a paragraph. So I'm just going to write it there. Obviously, I look like I can't write very well. This is not a whiteboard, guys. So if you could do a paragraph, I've done you some sentence starters to help you. So So many people died in the Titanic because, for example, so you could use some examples from the previous 2 bits that I've just gone through. You can pause and copy some ideas out, explain what you mean. So this meant that a lot of people died because, and then you could add another important reason or a less important reason, and then write a short conclusion. So you don't need to write loads, but I'd like to do a couple of paragraphs just to answer that using the evidence. Then I've put an optional extension. If you are really getting into this and you want to write a bit more, then please do, that would be great. A what if scenario. So have a go at like, what if they'd listened to the iceberg warnings and they slowed down? Do you think that this whole thing would have happened, or do you think it could be different? What if there were enough lifeboats? Do you think that would have made any difference, or do you think there wasn't enough time? So maybe have a go, and I'd be really interested to see what your answers are. Again, you can email me any work that you do if you want, or you can save it till we're back in school. But if you do that extension, if you want to email it to me, and we can put it in the newsletter and stuff, then I'm sure there'll be some really interesting answers. That'd be great. So pause the video now and have a go at doing those tasks for me. Okay, and finally, apologies that this video has gone a little bit long today. It's really hard to cut it down when we're doing such a big topic. But which company built the Titanic? How many passengers and crew were on board? How many people could the lifeboats hold in total? What feature of the Titanic did the engineers design to make it unsinkable? And why did this feature fail and even exacerbate the sinking? So have a go at answering those questions and see if you get them right in your fact book. So pause and have a go, and then mark them and see how you did. Next week we are going to start to look at the beginning of the First World War. So we've kind of started to look at the attitudes of people, what life was like. As we look through the First World War, I do like to talk about class and the upper class and the lower classes, because the kind of attitudes between the rich and the poor even show themselves in the First World War. So I wanted to give you a really good idea to get us prepared for thinking about it when we start the First World War. So we're going to start to look at the causes of the First World War in the next 2 weeks, which hopefully you'll find really quite interesting. Maybe instead of just seeing me, I'll try and find a hat or something to show you about the new kinds of Wilhelm, which we'll be looking at. But any questions, email me. I hope you've gotten okay this week, and I look forward to speaking to you next week. Take care, year 8. Bye bye.